Thanks so much for your kind introduction and dredging up my past. My parents, what's funny is my parents used to, after those profiles, when we'd have friends over, they would always, have people watch that CNN clip. And I would, be so embarrassed. I was like, it was nice the first time. So, but it's great to be here in Arkansas, my first time in Little Rock. I had as Skip put on Twitter, I had a busy day of meetings. I met with the governor, the lieutenant governor, some political staffers. And it's nice to be out of D.C. because while it's a great time to be a journalist in D.C., it's exhausting, and because Trump is against vacations for journalists and for his own staffers. Although I would mention I often see Kellyanne Conway at parties, and so it's not entirely clear what she does. She is, to be fair to her, and she's a very nice woman, very smart. She actually sold her polling firm to a big conservative PR firm for millions of dollars a couple weeks ago. But she was famous for telling the New Yorker that she basically expected Trump to lose and was going to take her family on vacation to Italy. But they have not had that vacation yet. But no, you often see her at parties out and about. She is one of the more social members of the administration. But generally, what's interesting about the social scene of administrations, and I actually wrote a piece about this for Politico magazine, is that it used to be that you would, at the start of administration, you probably saw this with the Clinton administration, you would meet people who came up to Washington or were new to town. They would go around, introduce themselves to DC society as much as it exists in Georgetown and other places, and get to know one another so they could work together. But you don't see that with this administration. They feel very isolated. One of my friends, he works in the State Department, and since he wants to have a good career after, he is now working for the anti-AIDS initiative part of the government, because there would be no one is going to blame him for working to fight AIDS around the world. And I think it's probably a better job than working for Rex Tillerson right now. People are very disappointed in Rex, to be honest. When you're the CEO of a global company, it's a much more fun job than getting beaten down by the president. Saying you're wasting your time doing your job and negotiating with the North Koreans. And so people expect Tillerson to be out of there by sometime in the next few months. What's an interesting wrinkle that a lot of people don't realize is that since when you join the administration, you have to sell all your stocks because you don't want to be affected by companies that you own. And so Tillerson sold all this ExxonMobil stock, hundreds of millions of dollars worth. But for that to fully take effect, the gains from that, you have to wait basically a year for you to not pay those taxes. And so if he waits until next January or next February, then he can leave and not pay the taxes on all that money that he saved. And so, because they don't want people going to the government, selling all their stock, and then reaping the tax benefits and then leaving after several months. As my introducer ably mentioned, I co-write Playbook, and so that entails me getting up at 3:30 or 4 a.m. every morning on weekdays, and I've done that for 3.5 years since I started Politico. And working on that with my two colleagues and basically providing a summary and a digest of the news with both hard news plus Trump's tweets, which are sometimes hard news, but sometimes it's just like, the stock market's booming, everything is going well. And we actually have a social, what we almost call a page 6 version of DC and what's happening at people's parties and who is spotted. And so we often, Jared and Ivanka, we spot them at different restaurants that they go to. What's funny about them is that they often eat alone. So they're not, sometimes they're with fellow senators, but most of their friends were in New York. And so they don't have a ton of DC friends, and they haven't made that many recently. And some of their New York friends have drifted away because most of them were liberal. And it's going to be an uneasy transition when they go back to New York, which people expect them to go back maybe by after the end of this school year, because they have three young kids, and so that would be a natural jumping away point. And if Jared gets in trouble, then that causes some further wrinkles, so he might have to stay in DC for that. But we we all write the newsletter. We have little Playbook sign-up cards where you can put your email. It's a free daily subscription. And we've noticed interest in the product go up. Politico is 10 years old. We started with 35 employees. Now we're at 500 worldwide, with 30 million page views every month. And so, as much as Trump hates what's being written about him, he's been a boon to reporters and journalists. Everyone is writing Trump books. Maggie Haberman, Glenn Thrush, Howard Kurtz from Fox News and formerly of the Washington Post. He's writing a Trump book. So that's been good, as long as he doesn't, take away our licenses, which we actually don't. Journalists don't have licenses. I looked in I have a driver's license, but no media license. But so it's ironic because if he was not president, he would have he might have been like a White House correspondent, because he just loves, being close to power. He's the type of guy that he would phone in tips and would be a great source for reporters in New York about who he was going out with, or which model he was hooking up with, and he will still call up reporters. I have not. My phone number is easily available online, so if he wants to find it out, he can give me a call. I haven't heard from him, but we did meet him during the transition in New York, and so going up to the 26th floor, it's pretty amazing when people I'd only read about were right there, like Jared and Steve Bannon, and so meeting them for the first time, and realizing that these were people. These aren't just media caricatures. And so Bannon is actually a nicer and more funny person in real life than he might seem. He's not the devil incarnate. I didn't smell any sulfur. But he does wear 3 shirts, which is weird. If you saw the 60 Minutes. And he has this great house in D.C. where he throws fun parties. I met Stephen Miller there last week for a party for Laura Ingraham. But Trump's promises, he has definitely his voters are still with him mostly, but I feel like he has disappointed some of them in terms of some of the drain the swamp talk, especially because right now companies and organizations are pouring money in Washington because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen and whether Trump is going to tweet against them, that they need to have lobbyists and representatives in Washington to protect them against whatever the Trump administration would do. And so the swamp is swampier than ever. But to actually address that, you would have to have widespread reform of Washington, and that is against the interests of a lot of people in the city, because if you're a typical congressional aide, for example, you start on Capitol Hill when you're 24, work there for 2 to 4 years. Maybe if you start on the House side, you work for a senator. You gain contacts, you go to parties, you meet lots of people, and then once you feel like you have marketable services, you go downtown, and so you work for K Street, and the myriad number of law firms, lobbying shops that are willing to pay for your services, and like a job on the Hill will pay between an entry-level job will pay between $35,000 and $50,000, and so when you move to K Street, you get paid double that, and they're trading on access. It's that they're not hiring you for your good looks or your ability to navigate around Capitol Hill in a physical capacity. They want to basically use you to get what their clients want. And so in Washington itself, if you've been there recently, it's glitzier than ever. There are new developments coming online every few days, it seems. There's always construction cranes. And so, so that has not changed. It's only gotten worse under Trump. And the people that do work for the government, if you work in an agency or a cabinet department, the very smart ones, they will leave and trade on their access that way. The ones that are frankly less intelligent, they will stay, and then those become bureaucrats often. And so and people criticize the government for inefficiency. That's the incentive system that you're operating against. But I think the biggest problem would be campaign finance rules, because to have a congressional race, you often need to raise between 5 and 10 million, and the donors, they're not just giving it out of a sense of charity. Often, it's using super PACs and lobbyists to raise that money, unless you're self-financing like Michael Bloomberg. And I'm sure Michael Bloomberg feels very peeved at himself that he didn't run. But I think we're probably going to see more of those billionaire candidates, like Mark Cuban. He is very interested in running, probably as a Republican, because they see that 2020 would look good for, would be a good opportunity for anyone who wants to defeat the president. Because if you're underwater, polling-wise, like President Trump is, it's much harder to win. And so he's lost a bunch of his supporters. And I think supporters will be less likely to, all of them, show up. And every Democrat that did not vote last year around for Hillary Clinton will show up this time around. And I think in the 2018 elections, you have this civil war brewing in the Republican Party, which is pretty unprecedented for the party that is governing. Even under President Obama, if you had, it would have been impossible to think of sitting Democratic senators saying President Obama doesn't tell the truth. He is not, he's not a good president. I would not vote for him again. I would not support him, like you saw with Bob Corker and Jeff Flake. And so there was a great New York Times story about how President Trump may be losing support, but he's consolidating the Republican Party in his image. It's becoming the Trump party. And if you're a moderate Republican, the party, you look at the party and you say, do I really want Steve Bannon, Donald Trump to be the leaders of the party that I vote for? Or would I rather stay home or vote for an independent or libertarian or even a Democrat? And so that's going to hurt the party next year in the midterms. We saw Nancy Pelosi say to a closed-door meeting of her caucus, that if Trump and Republicans don't pass tax reform, then Democrats can, basically the majority is theirs in the House. It's much harder in the Senate because of the map, but that's, Democrats feel like this could be a wave election, and so congressmen like Darrell Issa in California, he's pretty vulnerable And so Republicans could lose 25 seats in the House. And something people don't realize, which I actually didn't realize until recently, is that so Trump has made a lot of progress on getting judges confirmed and other nominees. But if the Senate, in the 25% chance that the Senate becomes Democratic next year, that means that he will be very constrained in getting his own nominees in place. And so if if there's another Supreme Court vacancy, you can't just appoint a Supreme Court justice, or President Obama would have done that with Merrick Garland. And so you need Senate confirmation. And so that will make it much harder for Trump to get his nominees past the Senate. And it's going to be, you already saw Mike Pence. He broke a tie the other day in terms of a financial regulation bill in the Senate. And so you would have to have Mike Pence break more of those ties. Something that Republicans always brag about is that there aren't they don't brag about this, but since there haven't been many legislative accomplishments, the thing that Trump has done is do a ton of these executive orders, which are actually not as effective as they seem. They just, and one reason is that executive orders, and someone high in the administration explained this to me, they don't supersede existing law. And so, and sometimes they're badly written. The first travel ban was written by Stephen Miller, who is not a lawyer. Stephen Miller is kind of a strange dude in the administration. He once went up to New Hampshire, which is, everyone was wearing, just country, New England clothes, and he wanted to help out on the Scott Brown campaign. But he was wearing his, very buttoned up, the clothes a suit and tie, very thin tie. And for the 2 weeks he was on the campaign, he just stuck to that uniform. He did not change out of it. And he was kind of a sore thumb because people were wondering on the Brown campaign, what do we do with Stephen Miller? Why is he even here? And Miller does not, I've heard stories about how Miller goes to a restaurant near his apartment building, sits at the bar, orders a 3-gin martini, drinks it pretty fast, picks up his pickup food as a takeout order, and then goes back to his apartment or to the White House to work. And so he's not at those parties that Kellyanne and I are at. I've heard that White House staffers, the birthday parties, when they have birthday parties, the young staffers, it's not with all their friends in D.C. It's often with just their fellow staffers. And so if you're a person that works in the Trump administration that comes from a liberal background, it's not the easiest to be that person, because all of your parents and all of your liberal friends, they talk behind your back. They say, how can you be working for Trump? I take a different view, which is that anyone willing to serve the country, we should applaud them for that. And so you have this triumvirate, especially of Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, and John Kelly, who are kind of being the adults in the room. And so a lot of Republican senators, even ones that aren't as outspoken as Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, they trust that these people will, rush the president if he's about to launch like a nuclear weapon or something. Just prevent that from happening, although that would be a military coup in some respects, so that would not be great for democracy. We all know that Trump is a big fan of democracy and the media. And I think Kelly, a lot of people in D.C. respect Kelly. He has brought order to the White House, but his job is not to stop the president from tweeting. And I was talking to a senior administration official recently, and I gave that person advice, which was if there's one thing that they could do, it's just to stop like the cable service into the White House so that the president couldn't watch Fox and Friends and react to the headlines he sees on TV. My favorite story of that recently is that he saw a friend of mine get interviewed on the show. He's a pretty young guy in his late 20s, and he wrote a book, saying Trump was great and the philosophy of Trump, how you can win in your daily life. And this was his first book. And so Trump, of course, in his signature style, he says on Twitter, highly respected author says, I am great, so, buy the book. And so that increased Amazon sales by a couple 100% for my friend. So that was good news for him. I think I was talking to Skip, and he suggested I kind of talk about the role of the Clintons. And it's Hillary's 70th birthday today. She is celebrating, I think, with a party tomorrow night for her friends, either in D.C. or New York. The Clintons have been in the news recently with this, the fact that they they spent money to pay for the dossier, the Russian compromising memo that this guy, Christopher Steele, the British intelligence agent, produced. And the Clintons, or the Clinton campaign and their lawyer, Mark Elias, they lied about this for the last year, the fact that they paid. But generally lawyers just don't like to talk about their clients. But I would make the point that Republicans are making this huge effort to smear the memo and saying it's totally fake news because it was bought by the Clintons. But we should remember that the president's own son met with people who he knew were Russians and some that were tied to the government to get compromising material on Hillary Clinton. And so it does feel a little hypocritical to focus so much on this dossier and who paid for it, especially when if you're Brian Fallon, the former communications person, you can just point to what Trump did. And so, but hypocrisy is nothing new in politics. But I've been surprised at how little the Clintons have been in the news recently, except for the book tour, which Democrats, to be frank, were dreading because it's opening up raw wounds that have not fully healed. And those wounds won't heal until Democrats or someone else defeats Trump in office, or just if he wins a second term, then once he's out of office. It will always be a concern, a festering wound, because I think a lot of Democrats feel that the Clintons, they threw away this election, that any other Democrat would have won it. And, but for the fact of Hillary's email server and the bad advice that she was getting from her inner circle, which should have realized that if you have a penchant for secrecy, it's probably not a good idea to set up the server. And but sometimes people are caught up in the blinders of their own existence, and so you think that the rules don't apply, or you just don't realize the optics of it. And I'm sure Hillary wakes up every morning and thinks to herself sometimes about what she could have done differently, and that must be a horrible feeling for anyone. I'm sure it's the same. And I also wonder, has she talked to Al Gore about, what it's like to, be so close to the Oval Office and yet lose to someone that, Democrats feared, and so I think there were also Americans should look at themselves in the mirror if they are troubled by anything Trump is doing. were they all marching? Were they all voting in November? Where was the Women's March when it could have had the maximum amount of impact? Like we all, Trump was famous for how he acted towards women, and I think kind of a side note, you're seeing a wave of news on sexual harassment. You saw Mark Halperin, who wrote Game Change and has long been on TV. His career basically went kaput last night when CNN reported that he had been sexually harassing various women he's worked with, and that continued into more recent times, I've heard. And so that's kind of the positive effect that the Harvey Weinstein scandal has had, which is that all of the stuff that people wouldn't talk about in polite company, that's coming to light as people just say it's not acceptable. And what's interesting is that Harvey Weinstein lost his job, and President Trump, who there was pretty substantiated allegations against him during the campaign, he won the election, and with tons of women voting for him because they all hated Hillary. And millions of American women still support the president. And that's because the country doesn't, if you're a person struggling to make it in middle America and you see the DC Beltway elites living it up and, enjoying record amounts of money and, having a great life in Washington, you feel like DC's not paying attention, because you're right, it hasn't been paying attention to, working class voters. But that's also, to change that's going to be a hard project, but it's probably a worthwhile, project to start, because you don't want Americans to lose faith in their democracy. Or you saw a poll recently found that, I can't remember the exact number, but maybe a third of Americans said, if Trump wants to cancel the elections, that's fine. He can stay. I just want to stay in office. The elections are too dangerous. So yeah, on that positive note, on that fun note, I'm love to take your questions, and thank you for coming out.
Okay, anything you want to know about politics and then some, ask him. Raise your hands. Yes, sir, back here.
In your opinion, would you think for a sitting, relatively unpopular executive, such as Trump, do you think if he was worried about his re-election efforts, that a military conflict with North Korea in which the U.S. would prevail would virtually ensure re-election in regard to having even a formal, or a very formal Democratic and popular candidate opposing him?
So that's a great question. I think that's one that, talking to people in DC, that's something they have not thought of a lot, which is the political calculations of this. I am not as cynical to think that Trump would cause a conflict with North Korea just for the fact of ensuring his reelection, because we already don't know if he even wants to stand for reelection. If you talk to, White House people, they say he could quit next year. He could quit if the Mueller investigation turns out really badly for him. But I think his stance on North Korea is more a matter of he is not skilled in diplomacy. For Trump, how he's operated is in his own life has been, I kind of dictate the terms. I don't like to be disrespected. I will fight back. I will punch back 10 times as hard as the person punching me. And so, and he also has the madman theory of international relations, which is if I act crazy, maybe Kim Jong-un will back down. But I think that that may not happen here. But I also don't think that if Trump is perceived as going into a avoidable war against North Korea with 1 million deaths of innocent Japanese and South Korean people on his watch, even if the U.S. prevailed, that is pretty shocking to Americans. I don't think Americans would countenance that, because I don't think Americans think, Americans worry about the threat with North Korea, but it doesn't seem like an existential one, because it isn't right now. And I think Trump has also talked about how he's against dumb wars, and so if he is viewed as launching a war just, a year before his election, then that looks a little transparent.
Other questions? Chris, microphone coming at you. Hold on just a minute.
What do you think will be the impact of the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party on the midterms in the next presidential election?
How popular is the Bernie wing here, would you say?
Among young people, pretty popular.
Yeah, so that's, if I put my political scientist cap on, which I never got a PhD in, so don't take my advice too seriously. But the parties have totally, swung in one direction or another. If you take my parents, they were big supporters of Bill and Hillary Clinton in the 90s. They liked the centrism. They were more liberal than him. But today they are, they really liked Bernie. And that's almost an indication that if one party goes far to the right, like the Republican Party has done in the last 15, 16, 17 years, starting with George W. Bush, then it's not entirely a surprise if the other party says, why are we the reasonable moderates and we're not winning elections as center-left folks, so maybe we should try something more liberal. In terms of the impact on the Bernie wing next year, it definitely has the potential to revitalize or continue to revitalize Democrats, and that would help the party's chances next year. But I think the big question is, do the young people especially who support Bernie and his policies, do they show up on an off-year election? If you, like when I went to George Washington University in DC, but I still had my voter registration in Massachusetts. And it took a little, extra effort to make sure I got my absentee ballot. I think there was one year that it came late, so it didn't really matter. And so for the typical, lefty college student, you have to be really dedicated to voting, especially if you are not registered in the city you live in. And so that's why some Democrats are putting in a lot of money into both voter registration and also redistricting, because Democrats, if the map is not favorable to you, it doesn't really matter what how the president or how the Republican or Democratic Party is doing. You're still not going to win. And so Democrats have not paid attention to state and local seats in terms of losing like 1,000 legislative seats in state houses over the last 8 years, and that's really hurt them. And so like their bench is pretty weak compared to Republicans in many states.
Yes, sir.
Do you think Hillary not visiting the Rust Belt states was a significant factor in her losing the election?
Yeah, I think totally that if she had taken the efforts to listen more to people's concerns in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, then she would have had a much better chance. I remember I wrote a story back in June for Politico, last June, about how there were Democrats who sometimes people call like the bedwetters that are always worried that Democrats are going to lose, but in this case they proved to be right, that she was going to lose the Rust Belt because Trump was popular there. Everyone knew that Trump was popular among blue-collar voters, among the Rust Belt states from basically day one of his campaign. He was the populist billionaire. And so if you don't even show up, then like, how can you expect people to vote for you? And especially when you had celebrities going out there and having great concerts in Philadelphia, that does not. If you're a steel worker in like the Alabama part of Pennsylvania, if you see headlines of Hollywood celebrities on stage with Hillary in the week or two before the election, that's not going to like make you think, oh yeah, that she's definitely with people who I know. So it's going to have the opposite effect, and so that the use of that drove away thousands of voters, I'm sure.
Questions over here, Bonnie? Yeah, we'll give you one.
I'm wondering about how long politics as usual with the people who are in power in the Democratic Party are going to hold it and not allow young people to come in with new ideas and new ways of doing things. It seems as though they have ignored and they have played it down. Where do you think it's going to go, and how far down the road before it'll change?
So if I'm getting your question right, it's you're asking a question about Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer without saying their names. And so, if I run into Chuck or Nancy, as the president calls them, I'll say, I have a person really respects you because they didn't even use your name asking about you in Arkansas. So the thing about those folks, and they're definitely not they're not my age, is that they actually have been proven pretty effective this year in terms of stopping Trump's policies. A lot of his agenda not moving forward was due to the president himself and disorganization on the Republican side in terms of they didn't know what they wanted. And so that's not Nancy and Chuck's, they can't claim credit for that, but they kept their caucuses unified because there was a lot of pressure on Democrats last year or early on this year to work with Trump more because their constituents were saying, you have to work with the president, like he's fairly elected, why are you trying to stop him at everything he's doing? And there's less pressure on those Democrats to do that. If Republicans aren't even supporting what the president is doing, then like why would Democrats do that? But I think going forward, you're going to see new leadership pretty soon. So I could imagine a scenario where Pelosi, if she reclaims the speakership, she does. That's in 2018. She serves until for maybe a year under that, and then passes the torch to someone else, who can lead the party into the 21st century. And with Schumer, he's pretty popular among his fellow senators, and so you would have to get younger senators elected to actually change that makeup, because as long as he's viewed as doing a good job, it doesn't really matter how old he is. And so as long as Democrats are making progress in the Senate and stopping Trump, then Schumer can rest easy. And what's funny about Schumer is that he gets along better, or Trump gets along better with him than he does McConnell or Ryan, because they're New Yorkers. They're basically cut from the same cloth in some ways. Maybe like Trump is Queens and Schumer's Brooklyn, so there's some of that interborough rivalry, but like McConnell is Kentucky, so and McConnell is not like Paul Ryan's much more personable than McConnell. McConnell, he's always mocked as like kind of the slow tortoise, and that's kind of that kind of fits him perfectly. But he's he's always been viewed as this very effective Senate Majority Leader. He's brilliant. He's a genius, and that was well earned until this year. And I don't think it's his fault that he hasn't been able to pass healthcare repeal. It's more the president. If there was any other Republican in the Oval Office, McConnell would have been riding high because they would have been doing, X, Y, Z.
Yes, sir. Got a question right here. Wait a minute. Hold on. The microphone's coming at you.
Do you think any of the world leaders take Trump seriously at all?
Netanyahu and Putin. Those are I was at Stanford last week, and Israel and Russia are the only two countries that the U.S. approval rating has gone up. So more people in those countries think more highly of America than other countries. Other countries, their views of America has declined. We shouldn't worry. We should worry about that, but it declined during the Bush years, and then America was riding high with Obama, and so those things, come and go. But I think world leaders, some of them have been hiring Trump-connected campaign lobbyists for thousands of dollars to get their voice in front of the president. Corey Landowski, he was offered $250,000 just to get Trump to tweet about their company. So that's kind of different from a foreign country. But I think on a personal level, Trump is more of a deal maker with leaders abroad. He doesn't know all the details. And so if you're his advisors, you have to make sure that he doesn't give away the store. Just how he had the deal with Democrats where he threw Republicans under the bus, while they were in the Oval Office. It would have been I would have paid a lot of money to just be in the head of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan as they're thinking, what's going on here? You said to us 15 minutes ago you wouldn't do this. You would stick by our side, and now you're jumping ship. And so I think foreign leaders probably are prepared by their staffers who read the U.S. media about how to kind of try to roll Trump, and so but we'll have to see how many deals he's going to make with foreign leaders. I have not seen a ton of those. They have made some progress on ISIS, for example, and other issues, but if they're unable to resolve North Korea, they wouldn't be the first administration that would have trouble with that. And so it looks like the status quo will just be that the U.S. just accepts that North Korea has a nuclear weapon, and that we were not, due to multiple different reasons, multiple different presidents, we're not able to stop that. And I don't think the North Korean regime is suicidal. We have not seen any evidence of that. They're pretty coldly and bloodily or bloodlessly strategic in what they're doing.
Yes, got a question right back here.
Thank you for coming and speaking tonight. In hindsight, do you think it would have made any difference if Joe Biden had stuck around? And are there any rumblings that he may be coming back on the scene?
So he told Vanity Fair a couple of days ago that he would not rule out 2020. And so that was pretty interesting. Although if you're almost anyone in public office, you usually just don't like to rule out anything. And so until there's a JoeBiden2020.com, I'm not gonna I won't believe that he's gonna run because he's pretty advanced. I think he because of the death of his son, he felt like he couldn't give it his all. And I'm sure he regrets that decision right now because sometimes the hardest things are the most important things in life. But I think he's definitely going to be a kind of an elder figure in the party, a respected voice. And when he says something, people will listen. And if he doesn't run, whoever he endorses will get a big boost. And but I think it's the 2020 field will be, crowded on Democrats. They're going to have to have multiple stages for debates probably if you have 25 people running. And so I think if Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders had been the Democratic nominee, then Donald Trump would be doing the Celebrity Apprentice right now.
Wow. Okay, you have a question right here. Hold on a second. Here comes your.
I was just wondering about your thoughts on how world leaders are seeing us in terms of stepping out of the Paris Climate Accord, getting rid of the Clean Power Plan. Are we ceding our power at this point? Will there be an opportunity to get it back at some point in the future on that? And then just a quick follow-up. I don't see a lot of stuff in the media about things like what Scott Pruitt up to today. And
he's definitely up to something.
Yeah, exactly. And things going on in various agencies that are fundamental changes. And do you feel like there should be more reporting on that, or do you think Americans just don't care?
I think people in this room care. And so if only everyone in America could be like you guys. But in terms of global leadership, most people who are experts in energy and climate say, we're totally against what Trump did on the Paris Agreement. His voters loved it, and Bannon was celebrating that day. I remember Scott Pruitt went to the most famous French restaurant in D.C., Le Diplomat, that night that Trump pulled out of Paris, almost to just stick it to environmentalists and say, I'm going to celebrate this at a French restaurant that everyone else in the dining room supported that agreement, which is that's how Scott Pruitt thinks. And so his moves on the environment have not helped the environment that much. But we should remember that because the U.S., how the U.S. is developing its renewable energy resources, and the fact that corporations view it as a plus for their businesses to become more energy efficient, the U.S. is on track to meet its Paris Agreement commitments, and so the U.S. will cut enough carbon emissions, even though the U.S. is no longer formally in the Paris Accords. Regardless, that's just going to happen. And so that is a bright light right now, giving some hope to environmentalists. In terms of the, I think at the depths of the Great Depression or the Great Recession, people were concerned about, if America was going to rise again. But I'm like the eternal optimist. America will always. America is based on how great the American people are. It's not based on who our president is. And so if you let the country get defined by whoever is in office, then that's not healthy for democracy. So if you didn't like Obama, Americans will still work hard. They'll still innovate. And so I'm not that worried that it's a permanent, we're not going to, in 2030, Trump will have been long gone, and America will, have a president. Maybe it will be President Barron Trump, but I don't know if Barron is as big a fan of Twitter as his father. So I'm not that worried that it's going to be if there's a new North Korea nuclear situation, that is one of those black swan events that one would worry about. And in terms of reporting, we actually have at Politico a weekly feature called the 5 things that the Trump administration did that no one paid attention to, and so I should probably read that more, but and link to it more in Playbook. But that's what you're seeing on a daily basis, which is that people like Interior Secretary Zinke, they're changing how the national monuments are structured. He's not selling government land, but the restrictions on some of those are going away. And I think Americans, you can't expect Americans who have busy daily lives and families to pay attention to the Federal Register. But and so the media does what it can. I think I would urge the media to focus on what the Trump administration is doing more on regulations and administration-wise and less on the tweets. But I think Americans have an obligation to pay attention to if there's a local meeting of if the EPA comes to your hometown and is talking about something that affects you, don't just let the lobbyists show up to the meeting and give comments. You stand up and present what you think, or at least get informed. That's the least you can do.
Daniel, we've run out of time, but I want to close with 2 questions and bring it back to Arkansas.
Okay.
1, would you assess the performance of Sarah Huckabee Sanders? And 2, would you speculate on the future of Tom Cotton?
I can take it that there are not many Cotton Fund supporters here, and so Sara Sanders. I remember I met her when she was a couple years ago when she was working for as a press secretary on a presidential campaign. But I think people, she's viewed as a much better press secretary than Sean Spicer because she hasn't lost her credibility. If she says something, it's, maybe she doesn't tell you the whole truth, and maybe it's a dodge, but it's not often a bald-faced lie. Like, she's not saying there are millions of people in the streets, supporting the president. Like, she often says, "I don't know," or "I'll get back to you," and I think every press secretary says that. And I think she says it in a way that she's not worried that she's going to lose her job. Because Sean Spicer, when he appeared, since he was constantly undercut by his own colleagues, that made it hard for him to be a good representative of the president. And so I'd expect her to last in the job for a good amount of time. In terms of Tom Cotton, if you've been reading The Palace Intrigue, you would expect Rex Tillerson to leave state in the next few months, and then Mike Pompeo to go to state, and then Tom Cotton to go to CIA. And so Tom may, what's funny about Tom is that his wife actually works in the CIA. She's on leave as a lawyer for the agency, so he's not unfamiliar. And I think he would view that as he would jump at the opportunity because, he feels like he could do a good job. He feels knowledgeable on the subject. And, I am not of the opinion that, all Democrats or all Republicans are going to public service for the wrong reasons, like self-enrichment. So I think, Cotton genuinely wants to serve, and so if he thinks to himself that he can serve the country the best way in the Trump administration as the head of the CIA, he's going to leap at that opportunity. You can criticize what he does as CIA director. What we've noticed is that they've become much more. They've let the CIA basically do what they want, and so that could cause some situations coming up where that doesn't always lead to perfect outcomes. And so you saw that with the military too. They made it much easier for the rules of engagement for the military, and so that led to, predictably, to hundreds of civilian deaths in Iraq as the U.S. was helping in the anti-ISIS fight. And so, and that is not good news when you're trying to win over a local population, so that they in turn don't join ISIS if they lost a parent.
Let's thank Daniel Lippman for being here. Great program. And for those of you that still had questions, come up and visit with him. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.